Well, I don't have many second-time guests, but it's a huge pleasure to welcome back Dr. Richard Johnson on the show to talk about the fat switch again and how to turn that thing off when we hit midlife. We covered a ton of it in our first episode, but there was still so much more. So you got to go to that first episode, listen to that, and then come back and listen to this one. And this time around, we're going to cover uric acid and diabetes and why women have such a hard time shifting belly fat when we hit menopause. Now, I hope you all have read Dr. Johnson's most recent book since that first podcast. It's called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat: The Surprising Science Behind Why We Gain Weight and How We Can Prevent and Reverse It. And this will give you all the details of what we've been talking about so far. And perhaps some of you have also read his first book, The Fat Switch, or actually he wrote a lot of other books, but the one previous to that was called The Fat Switch, which he published in 2012, where he takes an even deeper dive into the evolution of mankind. And to give you a little bit of background on Dr. Richard Johnson, he works at the University of Colorado in Denver as a professor of medicine. He's been keeping super busy these last 25 years, not only as a professor, but also both as a practicing physician and clinical scientist. He studies nothing else but our favorite drug, sugar. He is super well known in the medical circles for his research into diabetes and obesity. And he found out exactly how sugar causes obesity and how our bodies can actually make fructose, a type of sugar, from other foods. And he also found out that a byproduct of fructose metabolism called uric acid plays a huge role in metabolic syndrome, which we're going to dive into closer today too. So the National Health Institute of Health has been funding his research since the 80s. So he's been doing this for quite a while. Dr. Johnson is also a member of the American Society of Clinical Investigation, and he's published over, get this, 700 papers. He's lectured in over 45 countries, and he's highly cited. Just PubMed him, and you'll be blown away. I've done it, and it's mind-blowing how much work you got out there. So I really think we're speaking to someone who is highly qualified to talk about this topic. So without further ado, please meet Dr. Richard Johnson. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for the very nice introduction. That was very kind.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you back. So you are my favorite podcast guest. You're just so passionate about what you do. You're a great storyteller. You break the science down so easily. So I'm so glad to have you back. Our first podcast was just went way too fast, and we only had an hour, and we've only got an hour today too. So we're gonna really try to get as much information as we can in a short period of time. And so I want to recap a little bit about what we've talked about before, so that we don't have to repeat that. And we talked about your background and why you became a doctor, and I'm passionate about this. And we talked about obesity and it's how it's not a disease, and how it's normal and it's desired, and how animals would get fat to survive the winter, and we have this fat switch and the survival switch, and how we need to forage and all that. So that's super. We covered a lot that pretty well, and explained how insulin resistance is a survival mechanism, and we're supposed to get into that state, especially if we're going to be hibernating or getting ready for winter. Talked about fructose in great detail, and I'd like to cover a little bit more too, and how that just makes you hungry. And also not only fructose, but we covered just any high glycemic carbohydrates that can make fructose and activate that fat switch in us. And as well as we covered the kids, why can we just eat all this sugar as kids and not so much as adults? And we don't convert the glucose to fructose as well, and we don't have those enzymes primed in the liver yet. And I would like to cover again, I think, you did cover salt and alcohol and fruit, including in that fructose. And that was super, super interesting, how we need to be very mindful of those things, especially as we hit menopause. And you have a lot of great tips, which I won't reveal them here, because you can go listen to the first podcast. But generally, that's what we talked about. But I would love to go a little bit more into uric acid, because you are a specialist in uric acid, and how that affects women in particular as we hit menopause and even post-menopause, how, how concerned do we need to be about this?
Yes. Okay. So, just thank you for recapping. And probably the main thing, just for people to know, is that sugar is sucrose. It's a disaccharide that consists of glucose and fructose together. So it's actually two sugars. When we talk about table sugar, we're talking about two sugars, fructose and glucose, and they're bound together. And our work suggests that glucose is really important in generating immediate energy and driving, what we do every day. But fructose was really designed as a sugar to help store fat. And so it's a way of storing energy. It stores it as fat, and it activates a process that leads to fat storage as opposed to glucose, which is really to make immediate energy. And so that's the background. And it turns out that fructose is not just present in table sugar, it's also present in the sweetener high fructose corn syrup. And that's where we're getting most of our dietary fructose. But we also can make fructose. And this was a disappointing discovery because we originally thought that the problem was pretty much sugar and high fructose corn syrup, but it turns out that high glycemic carbs like bread, rice, potatoes, they can contain starch, and when you break down the starch causes the glucose to go up in the blood. And so we get this transient rise in glucose in our blood, what we call high glycemic foods. And that also can trigger the production of fructose. And the way fructose is produced is it's produced from glucose. So when the glucose levels go up, some of it gets converted to fructose.
Well, is it a lot? Sorry to interrupt you. I can't remember. It's some of it. Is that just like 50% or higher or lower?
It's really needs to be studied better in people. There is some evidence that that every day we make about the equivalent of a can of soda. So we're making the fructose, maybe 20, 25 grams of fructose every day. And if we eat high glycemic carbs, we'll make more. And we're planning to study in humans with a group from Switzerland to actually help quantify how much we make. But we do know we make a fair amount, and we know that when you eat like drink a soft drink, your production of fructose triples, and that's been shown in people. But it is an area we have to learn more about, and some people will make much more fructose than others too. The reason is that the conversion of glucose to fructose is a chemical reaction. And there's actually an enzyme, which is basically the substance that helps drive the chemical reaction. And so there's an enzyme that drives the production of fructose from glucose. And that enzyme, and when we're young, we don't carry much of it in our body. We have a little bit in our kidneys, but we don't have much. But as we get older, we start producing more and more of this enzyme. And you can find it, for example, in the livers of people who, are overweight and so forth. And so this enzyme gets turned on. One of the ways to turn it on is salt. And that's what your original question to me was, how does salt play a role in this whole process? So salt doesn't have any calories. So people usually think of salt as just something that, may raise blood pressure and may have negative effects that way. And so we're taught not to eat a lot of salt because it's been linked with blood pressure and thickening of the heart and stuff like that. But a lot of people don't think of salt as being important in obesity. And I certainly didn't think that. But when we realized that salt, when you eat salt, the salt concentration goes up in your blood, and that turns out to be one of the major ways to stimulate this enzyme that can convert carbs to fructose. So what happens is, like, if you're eating a lot of salt, you can actually show that you start converting, you can activate this switch by making fructose. And we've done studies in animals, and when we give them salt, it takes a long time. It takes several months. And so initially, everything's sort of the same. They don't really gain weight. In fact, they even may lose a little weight the first week, but after that, they basically stay the same weight for like a few months. And then suddenly they they start gaining weight like dramatically, and they lose their control of appetite. They start eating a lot more than they normally do. So they lose their control of satiety, or the sense of being full. And it's due to a thing called leptin resistance. There's a hormone that we produce that tells us, that we're full and it's time to stop eating. And we become resistant to that hormone when the fructose switch is turned on. And so when you're eating salt, you can show that switch gets turned on. And then the animals start eating more, and then they become very fat. So even if you control how much food they eat, they'll still get fatty liver and diabetes and all those things. So when we found that salt might actually be associated with obesity, we went back into the literature and found that there were like 10, 15 papers, a lot of it from Sweden, Norway, and Germany, and places like that, that showed that if you eat a lot of salty food, that over time it increases your risk for obesity. There were a lot of different theories for why that might be. One is that it might encourage you to drink soft drinks, and salty foods are part of processed foods, and so there's a lot of processed foods have a lot of bad things in them. And so, it was thought that maybe the salt was working that way. But interestingly, in parallel with these studies showing that high salty foods can increase the risk for obesity and diabetes, there was also a whole series of studies that in which people were looking at a hormone called vasopressin. And we have this hormone, vasopressin, which helps us conserve water. And when we get dehydrated, this hormone level goes up in the blood, and what it does is it holds on to water by reducing the amount of urine we make. So the urine becomes concentrated and kind of stinky and dark yellow.
Is
And
this why? Yes, guys, sorry to interrupt, because it just reminds me this is totally not related to women over 50, but men, I guess, over 50 who have prostate issues. They're sometimes encouraged to take vasopressin. And I guess that's to keep the urine concentrated and not, and I guess not have to go to the bathroom as much, or what's the connection there?
Well, actually, I'm not aware of vasopressin being given to people for that reason. There is like children who are urinating at night in their beds. That, an old treatment was to give vasopressin because it decreases the amount of urine produced, and you give them a little bit at night, they tend not to pee as much during the night.
Maybe that's why.
And I think that, yeah. But anyway, but getting back to this, there was this discovery that people who are overweight have high vasopressin levels. And this was discovered about 10 years ago. And there's been, over 100 publications. Some of them I've been an author on, but there's just like a huge number of publications showing that vasopressin is high in people who are overweight. And it also predicts if you're going to get overweight. So if you have a high vasopressin blood level, it's very likely you're going to become diabetic or obese over time. So it's like a predictor. The actual blood test is called a copeptin test. And it's a research test. Unfortunately, I wish we could just order it for everybody, but it's really a research test. Our group can measure it, but not many labs do.
Why? Because it's too expensive, or why wouldn't a
It's
doctor
not that
want access to
expensive.
that?
It's not that expensive. It requires a special machine, which we have, but yeah, and there are kits to measure it too. So they're not quite as accurate as the kind of method we use, but it is. But anyway, so people have high vasopressin levels when they get overweight. It's like dramatic, right? And so and that goes up when you're dehydrated. And interestingly, dehydration activates that enzyme that drives fructose production. So now we're beginning to tie these findings together. And when you eat salt, when you eat salt, your salt concentration goes up in your blood and you become thirsty. When we eat salty food, we become thirsty. And that's because it's creating dehydration. It is dehydration, but it's sort of an interesting type of dehydration, because when you eat salt, you're not losing water, you're rather gaining salt. So it seems like you don't have enough water around. So when you eat salt, you tend to drink water, and actually you tend to hold on to the water. And so salt actually is a way to encourage you to drink more water, because it creates a sense of dehydration. And what we found was that when salt concentrations go up, you stimulate the production of vasopressin, and you also stimulate the production of fructose. And then the fructose actually increases fat, but it also increases glycogen, which is the storage form of carbohydrate. And that takes up water. So actually the water, when you drink, the water actually moves into the cell to be with the glycogen. Kind of complicated. But basically, when you eat salt, you're stimulating vasopressin and you're stimulating fructose. And we realized that, that animals, when they store fat, they're using it not just as an energy source, but they also use it as a way to make water, because when you break down fat, you produce water. So like whales, when they're they'll eat a lot of food during the early part of the year, and they'll gain fat, and the food that they're eating contains a lot of water. They tend not to drink seawater. They of course drink a little bit while they're eating fish and stuff, but they try to pump the water up their spouts and through their baleen, or these teeth that they have. That anyway, so whales get fat, and then when they're fasting, they actually break down the fat as a means to generate water, because when you break down fat, you produce water. So it turns out that when animals store fat, they're storing it not just for energy, but to make water. So that's when you raise your serum salt concentration by eating salt, you create dehydration. Vasopressin goes up to help reduce the amount of water loss, like through the urine. But fructose is there to make fat, which is another way to try to help the animal in a dehydrated state by helping it store more water in the sense of storing fat.
That was a total revelation from our last talk. And as well, you explain it so well in the book. If anyone wants to know the exact mechanisms, you do go into great detail on how that, or if you haven't really followed it and you want to understand it better, please go get the book. But it was mind-blowing in your research that you found it. What I think you said was that it's not so much the salt, but it's the salt concentration. It's the right. We need salt and we need water and we need the balance, which has to be correct. And so, this makes me think, I always have to put into context, because a lot of listeners here are women over 50, and a lot of them have an active lifestyle. So they're athletic and And when you're athletic, you sweat a lot, and you probably sweat out a lot of those salts. So we want people to always consider their own situation before they
Yeah,
suddenly cut out all the salt, because you may need that. And it's not the salt that's bad, it's just, I think, the concentration, right? That's
right.
important.
Yeah, so it turns out that we actually did a study in humans. Okay, so anyway, so salt stimulates fructose and over time will stimulate obesity. And it does so by converting the carbs from glucose to fructose. So if you're on a low carb diet, eating a high salt diet won't do much because you don't have the carbs to convert to fructose.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
so if you're on a carb, the salt really helps convert the carbs to fructose. So salt plus potato, i.e.
uh,
like French fries.
who doesn't like, yeah, salt with their
Yeah, we love
potatoes?
French fries, but when you eat French fries, the carbs are mainly glucose, right? But when the salt's there, it helps stimulate the conversion of the glucose to fructose. So it really does activate this switch. So that's why French fries are so bad. And when you're on a low carb diet, if you're on a high salt diet, you tend to be safe because you're not converting that much. You don't have a lot of glucose to convert. Okay, so anyway, so salt works by when the salt concentration goes up, it activates this switch, and the switch produces fructose, and it also produces vasopressin. And a big discovery we had was that fructose actually is responsible for stimulating the vasopressin,
Hmm.
and that fructose is produced in the brain as well, and that when it's produced in the brain, it stimulates the vasopressin. And so vasopressin is actually part of it. And then when we actually went on further and showed that if we blocked a particular receptor in vasopressin, that we could block obesity from sugar or from salt. So that the way fructose works is it's working in part by stimulating this vasopressin receptor. And what's really interesting is that receptor is stimulating a hormone called glucagon. And these new drugs, the GLP-1 agonists, are causing weight loss, and they're blocking glucagon. So we think it's actually working through our pathway, this drug. And so it's sort of interesting.
So
So anyway, getting back to it, your point about salt concentration versus salt amount. When we realized that the salt concentration was what was triggering this, we did some studies, including in humans, where we gave salt with or without water. And so if we gave like salty soup to people, we could show activation of the switch immediately. But if we gave the salty soup with water to prevent the salt concentration from going up, then the salt didn't do anything. So when we talk about people going on a low salt diet, it's only telling half of the equation. Yeah. It's really the balance of salt and water. And if you eat a salty food with water, you can and drink a lot of water, you can block the effects of the salt. And so it's a pretty cool story. So if you're going to go to a bar and you're going to eat salted pretzels, drink a glass of water first so that your salt concentration goes down and then comes back to normal as opposed to going up. And as soon as you get thirsty, you've triggered this switch.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest takeaways from our last podcast was, yeah, just drink the water before you eat, or just drink it if you're going to eat a salty food or even sugary food. You having some water, glass of water before or after, try to dilute it. It would be a great idea.
Yeah.
I want to ask, I know some people maybe listening to this podcast for the first time instead of listening to part one, and they hear us talking a lot about the fat switch, when activating the fat switch, when you're even mildly dehydrated, right? We're not talking about even feeling the thirst, but you mentioned that being activated. So the big thing that you probably understand by now is the fat switch, you want it to be off, right? So, but if you could briefly explain what that fat switch is. I know you guys can read it in the full book, but how would you describe it?
Yeah, so when you either eat fructose or you make fructose, the fructose, when it's broken down in the body, activates a switch. And it's kind of like a dimmer switch. The more fructose you have, the more the switch is turned on. And it relates to the concentration of fructose. So if you drink a soft drink fast, you'll get a high concentration of fructose. If you sip the soft drink over 2 hours, you won't get that same effect. So it's really related to the concentration. And what the fructose does is it drops the energy in the cell. Normally we think of nutrients as producing energy, and nutrients do produce energy. But what we have in our cell is we have the energy is sort of in balance with the energy that's made by the mitochondria, which we call ATP. And so that is, you've got high ATP levels in our cells that gives us the energy to do what we want to do. And then there's stored energy, which is fat. And so there's this balance of how much ATP we make and how much stored fat or stored energy, which is fat. And what fructose does is it shifts the energy from instant energy to stored energy. So it tries to shift the production. The food we are eating gets relatively shifted to storing fat, and ATP levels actually fall. So normally we keep our ATP levels at a high level, but if we're making a lot of fat, we basically reduce the amount of ATP that's being produced, and we increase the amount of stored fat. And when the energy levels fall in the cell, it triggers all these chemical reactions, or when the ATP levels. And it leads to hunger, and it leads to thirst, and it leads to foraging for food. You start to look for food. It actually activates centers in the brain associated with searching for food. And then it also stimulates fat production. It blocks the burning of fat, induces insulin resistance. It raises blood pressure. It stimulates inflammation, kind of to protect you from things. And it's a lot of it is done by the production of a substance called uric acid. And that substance, uric acid, is produced when energy levels drop. So when the energy levels drop, it activates some chemical reactions, and you produce the stuff called uric acid. And a lot of people know about uric acid because we all carry it in our blood. But when you eat a lot of rich foods, like alcohol, for example, beer is especially good at it, can raise uric acid. Sugar raises uric acid. And when the uric acid goes up, it increases our risk for a disease called gout, where you get these uric acid actually crystallizes in joints, and you get this painful arthritis. And maybe 6 million people have gout in the United States. It's mainly in men, because women, when they're young, tend to have lower uric acids because estrogen helps get rid of the uric acid in their body. So it helps get rid of it through the urine. And so women, when they're young, tend to be a little more protected from cardiovascular disease, even from a lot of, there's even some evidence that they're protected from other conditions like obesity and diabetes to a slight extent. But you can certainly become obese or diabetic and when you're young. But then when you go through menopause and the estrogen levels fall, then uric acid levels go up in the blood, and they become similar to males. And so that's associated with an increased risk for heart disease and an increased risk for high blood pressure and all these complications. So anyways, yeah.
Do women catch up then with the gout? So,
Yes.
when they're younger, not so much, but once we're kind of an equal playing field, we do have the same risk as men?
Yes, absolutely. But, men have a head start, so it takes a little while to catch up. But yes, absolutely.
Interesting that estrogen is protective then. So would you, I don't know if in any of your research you found that women who are on taking estrogen or hormone replacement therapy, are they have less incidence of gout?
I think that's true. I would have to review the literature, but I'm pretty sure that's true. It should be. Uh, yeah, it should be true.
So, so you tell us then a little bit more about uric acid and what other,
Yeah.
you know,
So
problems that
the
we have
way,
with it.
yes, so the way the uric acid works when you eat sugar is it's produced inside the cell, and it tends to activate oxidative stress. And so this is bad thing that goes on. And what it does is it causes oxidative stress to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is where you're making ATP. That's what we call the energy factories. And what it does is it actually suppresses the mitochondria. So they make less ATP. And so what happens is the energy we're eating, since you're making less ATP, it gets shunted to fat. And so it's a brilliant system. It blocks the production of active energy and thereby allows the energy we're eating to be turned into fat as a stored energy. Okay. So the uric acid has a very key role in kind of resetting the energy of the cell. And by lowering the energy of the cell, it stimulates hunger and all these things. So people who have high uric acids in their blood tend to have a higher risk for obesity, diabetes, kidney disease, high blood pressure, fatty liver. And we've done lots of studies, and you can show that if you have a high uric acid, you're at increased risk for developing these conditions. So uric acid is a very helpful blood test because if it's high, it really does increase your risk. Now, we believe that it is more than just increasing the risk, that it's involved in the process. And one of the first studies we did was to look at children who were obese and hypertensive. And so these were like teenage kids. And we found that the uric acid really correlated highly with their risk for obesity and with their blood pressure. And we did a controlled trial where we lowered uric acid and we corrected the blood pressure just by lowering the uric acid in like 90% of the children.
Wow.
And we published it in the JAMA. It also had pretty significant effects on weight. And we didn't really, back in those days, we didn't really look at some of the other things, which I wish we had. But it turns out that subsequently, we've realized more and more studies have suggested that uric acid really does have a role in blood pressure and in obesity. But interestingly, and this is the trap, is that in animals, like when you raise uric acid, they will develop high blood pressure, they will get fatty liver, they will get insulin resistance just by raising the uric acid. And if you lower the uric acid, you can protect them. But once they become obese for a while, or once they've had high blood pressure for a long time, several months, then what happens is other systems take over to keep them obese and hypertensive. So what happens is they start developing low-grade kidney disease, and that also affects the ability to excrete salt, and that that continues to make the blood pressure high. And likewise, remember the uric acid suppresses the mitochondria from making ATPs by causing oxidative stress. But when you do that repeatedly for a long time, then the mitochondria start becoming suppressed even when uric acid's not being made. In other words, the mitochondria get damaged from the recurrent stress. So the problem we believe is that once you have activated the switch for years, and let's say that the easiest way to think about this is, if you're 22 and you, for the first time, start getting overweight, you probably know or remember when that happened and how easy it was to get back to your normal weight. In the very beginning, it's very easy to, with just a little bit of dieting, just a little bit of being careful, you can get your weight back. But if you've been overweight for, 10 years, suddenly it's a battle to lose weight. It is so hard to lose weight. And then if you do lose weight, it just goes right back to where you were. So there's, with just minimum problems. We believe, based on our research, that this is because the mitochondria get damaged over time. And so as they get damaged, then it gets harder to bring them back to normal. It's not impossible. It turns out that like exercise, special types of exercise can help get the mitochondria to grow back. You can actually get your mitochondria back. So exercise, things like vitamin C, intermittent fasting actually stimulates it. Low carb diets actually stimulate the mitochondria growth. And a lot of things that people are doing are really great ways to try to stimulate those mitochondria to come back.
You mentioned also a couple of other things I thought was interesting, carnitine and CoQ10.
Yes.
These epicatechins, is that including EGCG?
Yeah.
From green tea?
So green tea has substances that help bring those mitochondria back. And so what's kind of incredible, Zora, is that, there are all these things where people have written about and say, hey, this works. And when we understand the science, so suddenly we say, oh yeah, that's why that works, because it's stimulating the mitochondria to come back. That's why, and epicatechin is one of the more potent ones. It's more potent than epigallocatechin, which is the one in green tea.
Yeah.
So green tea, it's good, but the dark chocolate that one is a little more potent. And it's also in the guarana fruit from Brazil. Anyway, so these substances are good. Caffeine, believe it or not, has some benefits too.
Interesting. So, caffeine and uric acid. That to me is mind blowing. 5 cups of coffee a day for someone with gout.
Yeah. So it turns out that there's a metabolite of caffeine called alpha. Actually, there's a specific name, I'd have to look it up, but it's basically a methylated caffeine derivative that blocks the production of uric acid. And so when you drink a lot of coffee, you actually make an inhibitor of uric acid. It's a breakdown product of caffeine. And so it inhibits the production of uric acid. And so it reduces the risk for gout by like 50% if you drink like 5 cups of coffee a day. It also reduces the risk for diabetes.
Right? Without sugar. Absolutely. And milk, I don't know. Milk also has lactose. So, I mean, it's.
Yeah, so the lactose is safe. So there, I realized, when I wrote my book, there's actually data that dairy can lower uric acid. And it goes back for literature back into the 1800s, and it's never really been studied that well, but it's been reported that dairy products can lower uric acid, and dairy products, are often associated with good health, along with fruit. So, but there is this concern that certain milk proteins like casein may actually be bad, and certainly in the lay literature, a lot of people say that casein which is a protein in milk, may be bad. I've not studied it, and in my book, I kind of followed the standard medical line that suggests that dairy is generally good, especially low-fat dairy. but I realize it's a controversy and
Yeah.
it's something I'd like to study more.
I
But
think,
anyway,
but what about there's evidently the cows are different in Europe, say, as opposed to the US, and there's different, there's like A1 and the A2 grade, or do you know anything
yeah,
about
well,
that?
grass-fed versus grain-fed cattle. I mean, there's no doubt that you do get a better fatty acid profile. It's probably much healthier to eat grass-fed beef and grass-fed. I don't know so much about the milk, but yeah, it's been associated with a change difference in fatty acid profile, and you get more omega-3, less omega-6 with grass-fed.
Yeah.
So there's all these different uh, things that have been done, but there is no doubt that some fatty acids, particularly what we call omega-3 fatty acids, can actually block fructose effects. And
So you mean
so
take your
yeah,
omegas in
there's this
addition to the
beautiful
CoQ10 and all that?
yeah, a beautiful study by a collaborator, a friend of mine. He gave omega-3 with fructose, and he could block a lot of the effects of fructose, like on the brain and stuff. And, I don't think we totally know how it works, but it seems like omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. And, part of the way fructose works is through inflammation. It causes low-grade inflammation. If you have a cold or if you're sick, having a little bit of inflammation can help you fight the cold. So it probably was a survival tool. But if you're chronically have low-grade inflammation, it's associated with heart disease, bad things over time. So it's like, yeah. So I think the omega-3 protects by being anti-inflammatory, just like omega-6 fatty acids may be pro-inflammatory. There's certainly some data supporting that. So anyway, so there is this interaction of other foods with fructose, and you can neutralize the effects of fructose with omega-3. You can neutralize it somewhat with vitamin C. Vitamin C blocks some of the effects of fructose.
But you mentioned, speaking of vitamin C, in terms of, the steps to cure obesity, to increase your energy production in the mitochondria, you said to beware of vitamin C because it stops the mitochondrial production.
Yeah, so this is discouraging, but yeah, let me tell you. So vitamin C is an antioxidant, and and the way uric acid activates the switch is by causing oxidative stress to the mitochondria. So vitamin C is like a natural blocker of the switch, and so it helps block that switch. So it should be good. But we talked about how we get trapped with low mitochondria and that we want to stimulate mitochondrial growth. And the ironic thing is you've got to have a little bit of oxidative stress to stimulate the mitochondria to grow. So if you have a lot of oxidative stress, it damages the mitochondria. And if you have a little bit of oxidative stress, you have to have that to grow mitochondria. So you want to tickle the mitochondria with some oxidative stress to grow them, but you don't want to hit them hard with oxidative stress because it will kill them. It's very complicated. I'm really sorry to tell you this. But anyway, so there's some data that says that if you take vitamin C before you exercise, that it can block the ability of exercise to stimulate mitochondrial growth. Because when you're exercising, you're getting this very, very mild oxidative stress that stimulates the mitochondria to grow. So they say that, that, for example, there's some data that allopurinol, which is a drug that lowers uric acid, may actually help the mitochondria grow because you're kind of blocking the excessive injury. But if you give a large amount of vitamin C, like a gram to a person, you may actually block the ability for the mitochondria to grow. So like my friends that are like professional athletes or that coach professional athletic teams and stuff, they are wary of giving large doses of vitamin C. And the literature suggests it's like a gram that can do it. So one of the thoughts that I have, and actually it was suggested to me on another podcast, that maybe people should take like 250 milligrams of vitamin C with each meal to block the oxidative stress associated with any foods that are being converted to fructose. But then if you're going to exercise, to hold the vitamin C, for several hours before it. It's sort of an interesting idea. But anyway, we don't really know the right answer. So in my book, I said, well, the data suggests that taking a gram a day is not good if you're trying to rebuild your mitochondria. But like 500 milligrams a day, there's not any evidence that doses of that level interfere. So I think a little bit of vitamin C is good. A lot may not be as good as we want if we're trying to rebuild our mitochondria.
Yeah. So again, context is everything. And what is it that you want to do, especially in this biohacking community where we like to triple and double dose things when we test it out on our bodies. But yeah, so, maybe when you're fighting a cold or a flu, you can maybe increase. But if you're trying to build the mitochondria, obviously be careful with that. But I wanted to go back a little bit because it was interesting how you mentioned you were sort of locked in this weight, undesirable weight. We wanted to talk about unexplained weight gain in women when we hit midlife, and how we unblock this is, one of your recommendations was to increase the energy production with your mitochondria. But I'm wondering, is there any differences that you're seeing between men and women when it comes to trying to lose weight when you hit midlife? It seems to me, around my own just world, men can lose it so much easier than women.
Yeah, I think that could be true. Yeah, I do believe that's true. And one of the sad parts is that there's evidence that for the same level of uric acid, women are more sensitive. And so, for example, like if you have a uric acid of 7 and you're a woman, you have a 10-fold increased risk for developing kidney disease. But if you have a uric acid of 7 and you're male, it's like 2-fold increase. So there, and this has been shown again and again. So women seem to be a little bit more sensitive. So in the early part of life, women will have a lower uric acid, which helps them, but they're probably still a little bit more sensitive to it than men for the same level. So after menopause, when the uric acid goes up, in some respects, as the uric acid goes up, the women are probably being hit harder. There are probably other factors driving this too, but it is true that also women tend to be smaller than males, so males can hide fat more easily. There are many, many different factors, but I do think that there's two things we need to do. One is you want to activate the switch as little as you can, because that's what's driving obesity, right? And then you want to stimulate the recovery and repair of the mitochondria. So there's two things. You want to prevent further injury, and you want to stimulate repair. And one of the things that seems to be very effective is drinking water. I do recommend drinking 8 to 10 glasses of water a day. But I do want to caution that there are some people who can hold on to water, like if you have heart failure or if you have any kind of significant health condition. And so you don't want to be drinking a lot of water without talking to your physician, if you have a significant heart condition, because some people can hold on to water. And another issue is like if you have surgery, oftentimes the days after, the immediate 3 to 5 days after surgery, people can hold on to water, and especially women who've had gynecologic surgery. And so no one quite understands it, but anyway, you don't want to drink a lot of water right after a hysterectomy or something, because you can really get into trouble.
Interesting.
And then the other group that can get into trouble are the groups that the people who are super athletes that tend to do long distance running. And what happens is if you do long distance running and you get behind, so you get a little bit dehydrated, if you drink too much water, you can rebound and hold on to the water. And there have been deaths, like in the Boston Marathon, from people drinking too much water during a marathon. And so the teaching is that if you're doing a marathon, you drink to thirst. You don't, if you get thirsty, drink until the thirst is gone, and that's it. And so there are these exceptions, but for the average bear, for you and me, if we're not doing long distance running and we our health is relatively good, drinking 8 to 12 glasses of water a day may make a huge difference in terms of helping us lose weight. It suppresses that vasopressin. It suppresses fructose production. And my belief is that will be associated with improvement in your mitochondria. We did a study in people where we put them on a low salt, low sugar diet, just to really try to cut back on these things that can activate the switch. And then we measured mitochondria in their white blood cells in the circulation, and they went up. We could show an increase, a 30-fold increase in like 1 month.
Wow.
So I mean, it's like, it was RNA, so it may not. We were looking at, actually, it was mitochondrial DNA. Come to think of it. So yeah, no, it's like real. So try to reduce activation of the switch, doing healthy things. But when you read my book, you'll see that there's so many things that can activate the switch. I'm not telling you never to eat sugar again. I'm not telling you can't eat a potato. I'm just saying that these things in large amounts can activate the switch. So you have to be, I go through the, recommendations, that I believe are reasonable, but I'm not telling you never to eat these foods that, we naturally are attracted to. I mean, when it's my son's birthday, I have a piece of cake. I try to make it a small piece.
Yeah. What
I
is
don't
your
go
life
back
look
for
like?
seconds. Yeah, I don't go back for seconds like I used to.
Knowing what I imagine it's probably pretty hard. The more information we have, then I mean, I think it's empowering, but at the same time, it does kind of control you in a way that you realize, okay, I can't go out of control with this. I have to be mindful. Yeah. Life is that way. No one's gonna, it's very difficult to, and I don't think it's healthy to be, 100% quote unquote healthy, removing all these things in your diet. We do need salt in our life. We do need some sugar in our life. We do need otherwise we wouldn't be, functioning. So it's just that it's always the devil's in the dosage, even when it comes to water. And again, I want to stress to people, I think, who are listening, if people are listening to my podcast are a little bit more than the average Joes, right? This is the biohacking community. So people who want to optimize their health, who are already pretty healthy. So I want them to take this with a grain of salt. If you're obese and sedentary, great. Then, all this stuff I think is really applicable. But, for increasing your mitochondria, for more energy, for example, you mentioned lower salt to 5 grams per day. But again, are we exercising in hot weather? Maybe, some of my as health coaching clients, I would say you need to add a little bit of salt, tiny bit, a fraction, a dash.
Yes.
Your water
Absolutely.
when you go and train.
Yeah. I have a person who contacted me who's, been following a very stringent diet, low carb, keto, and his energy levels are low. And he has no fat stores, and I just it looks like he may have a little bit of a chronic viral infection of some sort. But having a little bit of fat stores may actually be good. And the literature definitely shows that if you're like 70 or older, that having a little excess of fat is associated with living longer.
Yeah, you
So
mentioned
actually,
that in the
the
book.
B,
Yeah.
if the BMI of 27 is associated with living longer, so being a little bit overweight, if like you have heart disease, or if you have cancer, or if you're just getting older, may not be such a bad thing,
Yeah.
for people who want to live the longest. But in general, we don't want to carry a lot of extra fat. We don't want to be at risk for diabetes. We don't want to be obese, but having a BMI of 26 or 27 may not be so bad.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, it's actually probably a benefit.
Yeah, it's again how it's a number, right? It's the amount of fat you have. Now, is that
Right.
contributing to disease? That's the most important, right? But
That's
when
right.
I get into women over 50, we have this unexplained weight gain. We feel like
Yeah.
we're going to call ourselves obese. We're not, but we
Right.
kind of you see yourselves getting bigger and bigger, and it's very frustrating. And it's the hormonal
Yeah,
change.
absolutely.
And so this is why we have this unexplained, lots of unexplained things because of our hormones. And so
Yes.
this is very interesting. I am all about energy, so I love your tips on energy production for the mitochondria. Lowering the fructose, and you did recommend. And this would be interesting to hear your opinion. Exercising in a fasted state. And this one is a little bit I'm struggling with because as a woman, we do need a little bit extra fat. We have our hormones. We do need some carbs to fuel these hormone production.
Right.
And so there's for the longevity aspect, you think, yeah, that's great. This is what the literature is showing. But at the same time, when you're an athletic woman, this is in my practice and what I've been researching lately, it's actually better to fuel those workouts. And again, I think it's again boils down to very personal experience.
Yeah.
If it works for you, great. But I have a lot of women who are over 50 who are struggling and it's not working for them. And I'm wondering, yeah, if you found any
Yeah.
research
So,
on that.
well, you're right that if you're exercising for performance, things like glucose loading and things like that may actually aid performance, because it gives you good glycogen stores so that you can really exercise at your best. So, like if you're going to be in the Tour de France, a lot of those people, will actually glucose load
Well, not even the
for.
Tour de France, but just, if you're going to
Yeah,
do a
yeah,
HIIT class or,
yeah,
ride your
yeah.
bike
And if
for
it's high
30 minutes
intensity
or something. Yeah.
exercise, absolutely. On the other hand, what's been shown is like if you're trying to lose fat, if your goal is to lose fat, the way it works is when we fast, we tend to burn glycogen first, and then we burn fat. So glycogen is the carbohydrate storage. So let's say that I'm in my old stance, the way I was 10 years ago, and eating little snacks off and on throughout the day, not so good, but eat some chips or whatever. And so I'm eating these carbs during the day. And so I have good glycogen stores. Now I exercise, and I'm hoping to burn off that fat around my belly. But what happens is you preferentially burn the glycogen first, which is in your liver and your muscle and so forth. And so you don't actually burn the fat, because a lot of the exercise, you're just burning the glycogen that you've been building up all day. On the other hand, let's say that I go to bed, and during the night, I'm not eating, I'm sleeping. So the body views it sort of as a fasting state. Sleep is a fasting state. So it's burning the glycogen while I'm sleeping. So in the morning, now my glycogen stores tend to be low. It takes about 8 to 10 hours to burn off most glycogen. So if I get a good night's sleep, 8 hours sleep, my glycogen's relatively low. Now, if I exercise without eating any carbs, what happens is I'm going to be burning the fat as opposed to burning the glycogen. And so studies have shown this. And they actually did, one of the studies was done here at the University of Colorado.
But aren't they done mostly on men anyways?
Yeah, I think so. I think they have been. Yeah,
we need more
you
women.
got me. Zora, you got me. I think it was mainly men. Anyway, I didn't do the study. But anyway, if you're exercise while you're fasting, you'll tend to burn fat more than you will glycogen. So that's the theory. So it's all about what the purpose of the exercise is. So if you're trying to burn fat, trying to do it in the setting of not eating a lot of carbs beforehand will help, but your performance may not be as good. You may not be able to do as much because you don't have that glycogen, which really is needed for high impact, high intensity sports.
And strength exercises. I mean, when we get older, we want to lift more heavy things. So we need, I think personally, I would need a better performance in order to push harder, in order to be able to build more muscle so that I can burn more fat with the more muscle storage I have.
I think there's some data from Steve Finney and others that endurance sports tend to do okay with burning fat, but it's the high intensity that you need glycogen more for. So, so it's totally correct. It is the problem though. How do you get rid of the fat? And caloric restriction will help reduce fat. Interesting, people who go on a low carb diet often don't have to calorically restrict, because when you go on a low carb diet, hunger goes down, and so it's like a natural reduction in calories, because you just get full sooner. But when you're overweight, you want to try to figure out how to burn off the fat, and then also restore the energy in the fat, the mitochondria, and also how to block the switch. Working kind of three ways, burn off the fat you have, make the mitochondria healthy so you don't regain the fat, and quit activating or reduce the activation of this switch.
Well, you have all of that, all these great tips in the book, which it's really, really detailed, gram per gram, minute per minute. It's wonderful how much in detail you do go. I didn't see though, and I don't know if any of your research, you've done so much research, and unfortunately there's just not enough research on women, but have you noticed any difference on female hormones influencing fructose metabolism at all? Or uric acid production, for that matter, in terms of hormones itself?
Well, so one of our more recent discoveries, and it's not all published, but I'm funded by the NIH, is that we can show that when you drink alcohol, that the alcohol also activates the switch to make fructose.
Bummer.
So if you give it's a bummer because I love wine, but certain alcohol is worse. So like hard alcohol, where it's really concentrated, and you often mix it with sugar, right? You mix it with margaritas, and those will really activate.
Even if it's a gin and tonic, I know a lot of my clients think, oh, that's the calorie less one, or the less damaging one.
The tonic won't.
And that's hard
gin
alcohol.
Probably doesn't. Gin will do a little bit for sure.
So you're saying it's more the fructose, the sugar from the cocktails that's doing more damage.
So what we know is that you can just use alcohol. So alcohol will activate it. And beer has substances in the beer, like the yeast extract, that will really activate it. Wine activates it the least, because it's not as concentrated as hard alcohol.
So that's the safest. If someone's going to drink alcohol, drink a glass of red wine, very slowly, exactly. Maybe put some ice cubes in there.
Really enjoy sipping it. Yeah.
Squeeze it out. So
anyway, when we give alcohol, we find that it does convert to fructose. And here's what's really interesting: if we block the fructose, animals will drink less alcohol, and they also don't get the liver disease from alcohol. So the liver disease from alcohol is due to the conversion of fructose, and this is a big discovery. And so I'm actively working on this. But interestingly, it's been known that women are a little bit more susceptible to alcoholic liver disease. And when we study female laboratory mice, they're particularly more susceptible to alcoholism and to alcohol-related complications.
How do you get them to drink alcohol? I would think the mice would not want to have that.
Well, what you do is you start with a low concentration of alcohol, and you have two bottles. You have one bottle with water and one bottle with low concentrations, like 3% alcohol. And they actually do like the 3%, and they'll drink preferentially, drink a fair amount of it. Whoa, and then after you do that for a while, then you switch to 6% and then to 10%, and some go up to 15%. I see. And you can actually train mice to become, where they'll become alcoholic. And we've even done studies where we've created a little press where they press a lever and to get a drink of alcohol. And so you can actually, it's called self-operant testing or model. And so you can get animals to get addicted so that they'll go to get their drink and they'll press the lever to get their drink. And if we block fructose metabolism, they will reduce the amount of alcohol they seek. So there's this thought that if we could block, and it's been known that people who like sugar tend to like alcohol and vice versa. And in fact, it's a classic kind of clinical pearl for physicians that when a patient gets admitted who's an alcoholic and the alcohol is removed, you'll almost always see sugar or soft drinks on their side table next to their bed, because they switch from the alcohol to the sugar. So the two things are really tied together, and so we're actually funded to try to figure out if we can block sugar, can we actually could that be a new way to treat alcoholism?
That could be very interesting, because I always think, I try to tell my clients to, reduce the alcohol intake, or because when you take the glass of wine or the extra glass of wine, then it just kind of cascades into poor decision making. And you think, I'll just eat that pizza, or I'll just have the whole piece of cake. I don't care. So it's not like they're craving the sugar.
So true.
But the motivation goes down and the willpower goes down. But it sounds like actually there could be, another cycle, a reverse cycle where, if you actually do have that piece of cake, then you go, I'll have a glass of wine now.
Yes, it goes both ways. It definitely goes both ways. And if you mix alcohol and sugar together, the animals will drink a lot more alcohol, and they'll drink a lot more sugar. It potentiates. So.
One thing you did talk a lot about in the book, or you mentioned a bit, is wearing the blood glucose monitor, which I'm also a big fan of. The continuous blood glucose monitor, it's like little size of a quarter, and you put it on your arm, and it's got a little pin, and it measures the interstitial fluid, and you can see when you eat food or when you're highly stressed, your blood sugar levels rise, and then you watch them fall. And so you mentioned that, you would use this, and it could help you determine when the fat switch is on or off. And, what level would that be? Is there a number that you could give, or does everybody individually?
Well, we're going to need to do more studies to figure out what is the magic level. But I can tell you that so when you eat, there's a lot of individual variability. So some people can eat a banana and their glucose levels go up a lot, whereas another group may not. Another person may not have that same level. So the beauty of the CGM, or continuous glucose monitor, is you can kind of figure out which foods give you that big spike in glucose. And you can also do tricks like putting like avocado on bread. You can block the high glycemic effects of bread often by making a sandwich or something where you have like avocado or something like that
A
that
fat,
slows
some
the
kind of a
absorption
fat,
of
yeah, or a
glucose.
protein, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that it's very helpful. What I do know is that from extrapolation in the literature, it seems like if your glucose crosses 140 following the ingestion of some of a food, you're probably making some fructose. And the dream would probably be to try to keep your glucose levels to 120 or lower, but it's very hard to do that if you're eating any kind of carbs like potatoes and rice. It's very common to get a glucose
Oatmeal.
level, yeah, to like 130. But if you're aware of what foods can do it, it can give you the ammunition you may need to say, okay, well, that food really raises my glucose a lot. I think I'm going to pick this other food instead to eat.
But we couldn't say it's at 120 is when the fat switch goes on. We can't say yet. Is there a number?
It's going to need to be done in humans. It's going to be needed to be done in a research study. And my guess is that it's going to vary too. So like if you have high levels of that enzyme because you've been eating a lot of salt for the last 2 months, you might convert at a lower glucose level than another person. So actually what I really want to do is to develop a blood test to tell whether or not you've activated the switch.
Yeah.
And there are potential things that could be done to look for that. And so I'm hoping in the next year or two to actually run some studies to see if we can identify so for example, like the conversion of the glucose to fructose, if we can look for that like in circulating red blood cells, it might tell us if you're at risk for developing diabetes from high glycemic carbs or not. Because when we're young, you can eat potatoes and they won't be converted to fructose very well, But as we get older, we start converting and can make fructose much easier from these foods. And so understanding, why someone can eat French fries without any problem and another person can't, it would be very interesting. My guess is the more French fries you eat, the more you're going to become sensitive to it too. So when you're really young, you may not be sensitive to it, but over time, if you're eating the wrong foods, it's going to build up and get you at some point.
That's what it seems to be happening to most people.
Yeah.
That's why we get frustrated as we age. We think, why can't we lose the weight like we did when we were younger? And so it's a very good guess. And I wanted to ask briefly then, we're talking about the glucose monitors and activating the fat switch. A lot of my clients were very surprised about how stress can increase their glucose levels as well. And with that, they were like, I swear I didn't eat anything. And I said, well, it was that meeting that you attended.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering then, can stress activate fructose production and then flip on that fat switch?
I think it can. So stress, like when you activate the sympathetic nervous system, and you get that adrenaline, it can raise blood pressure and activate all kinds of things. And we haven't specifically looked at it, but this system that drives the production of fructose seems to be very, very, it's initiated by lots of different types of stress. So like if your blood pressure is low, if the oxygen levels are low, if the nutrition's low, or if you're dehydrated, all these things tend to activate the switch. So my guess is that stress probably does activate it to some extent, maybe not in everybody, but it certainly would be consistent with that idea. We haven't proven it though, Zora. So
Well, something to look
but yeah,
to in the
yeah.
future.
But I bet you it's true.
Yeah. So,
Educated.
there's, I wanted to ask you then also about, if you listen to the first episode, we learned that activating this fat switch is actually a survival switch in the wild, or in, historically. And actually, you did an amazing job explaining how we had this gene mutation, and how actually, yeah, saved the human race at least. And we are able to store fat in order to survive the winters, or the
Yeah.
drought, or the lack of food, and be able to evolve. But so I'm wondering now, in the modern world, we obviously don't have, these famines, and we don't have lack of food. We have too much of it. Would there be any advantage of sort of activating this fat switch somewhat? Like, in the wintertime, people, just even healthy people, tend to generally gain a little more weight. And in the winter, they sort of shed it off. We're not talking about huge amounts, but they tend to wave up and down like this. It wouldn't be unusual. Is that, a good thing or a bad thing? Because I do remember with my course with Dr. Volterlongo, he told us that it's actually better just to be fat, just stay fat, rather than have these fluctuations. And I'm guessing he's talking about this excessive yo-yo dieting. But what about sort of a gentle, weight gain, and a gentle weight loss as the seasons go? It seems quite natural to the human race.
It is probably natural. And there's lots of reasons why that can happen. I would say that there are situations where we've talked about how there might be a benefit activating the switch. And I think one of the big ones is in cancer victims where they've lost their appetite. And we actually are working with a scientist here who has animal models, where animals basically are losing weight and not doing well. And, we're thinking that this might be a situation where stimulating the switch uh, and, can maybe a benefit to people. Anorexia nervosa is another one. So there's a big ward over at Denver Health, which is one of the local hospitals, where they're kind of an international expertise in the management of anorexia nervosa. And we've done some initial studies over there. We talked about trying to find ways to stimulate the switch in gentle ways, and where we can help them.
Okay, that's interesting, because in this course with Dr. Longo, he was very much about cancer patients doing calorie restriction or the fasting mimicking diet in order to, in conjunction with their treatments. And
there is that, yes. So there's another side to it. So if you're malnourished and not able to eat, and you're losing muscle, and improving nutrition is critical for survival. On the other hand, many cancer cells tend to like fructose. So, and so that is also a problem. And uric acid actually can drive cancer growth. So there's two sides to it. If you're dying of malnutrition, anything you can, let them eat anything they like, even if it may not be good for them, because you just really want to boost their nutrition. But if they're doing fairly well, then you do want to avoid foods that might make the cancers grow. So the story behind that is as follows. So remember that fructose suppresses the mitochondria. It makes uric acid. The uric acid suppresses the production of ATP. And so ATP levels are lower, and there's more calories going to fat. Well, when we breathe oxygen, a lot of the oxygen we are breathing is used by the mitochondria to make ATP. So the production of this energy requires oxygen. So when we suppress the ATP production by the mitochondria, the mitochondria use less oxygen. And so it turns out that some animals will make fructose to help survive low oxygen states. So there's a mole rat, a naked mole rat, who lives in Africa. And this little guy burrows in these little burrows in the desert where there's very little oxygen in there. And like a normal animal would die very quickly, but it's surviving by producing fructose, and the fructose suppresses the oxygen requirements by suppressing the mitochondria and shifts the energy to the production to glycolysis. And glycolysis is another way to make ATP that doesn't require oxygen at all. And so it's a primitive system. It's much more primitive. It makes less ATP than normal, than the mitochondria, but it doesn't need oxygen. And so you can produce low levels of ATP without oxygen. And the mitochondria are still making some ATP as well, but the oxygen requirements are down. So it turns out that cancer cells, when a cancer cell metastasizes, let's say it goes into an organ and it's planted in the liver. Initially, it doesn't have a blood supply like the regular liver cells do. But then over time, it will start, as it grows, it will start developing its own blood supply that can bring in oxygen. But for a long time, these cells are living in like a low oxygen state because they don't have a blood supply. And so what they do is they like fructose because the fructose is a nutrient that reduces their oxygen needs. And it's actually got a name, it's called the Warburg effect. And it's been shown that cancer cells can live on a low oxygen state. And so they love fructose. So if you give fructose to cancer cells, they grow much faster. And that's been shown for breast cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, not all cancers, but a lot of them. And these cancers tend to be higher in people who are overweight. And it's probably related, I believe, to this fructose and the uric acid. And in fact, we did a study where we raised uric acid in mice by blocking this enzyme that normally the mice have that lowers uric acid. And when we blocked it, the uric acid levels went up. And then when we injected tumor cells under their skin, they spread much faster in the setting of this high uric acid, or high fructose does the same. So it turns out that fructose is not just driving metabolic syndrome, but because it was meant to be a survival system to let you live in a low oxygen state, it happens to be really a good fuel for cancer cells. And so that there is this association of fructose with cancer and obesity with cancer, which is probably related to this pathway.
And Dr. Long would add protein to that list.
Yeah.
But I still find it amazing that doctors are not, who have patients, cancer patients, do not give dietary recommendations. I meet so many people still to this day. And when I ask, oh, did your doctor give your mom or whoever has this cancer a diet? No, they can eat whatever they want. You think, wow.
I think reducing carbs would be a great move if you have cancer. But if you're severely malnourished, again, it makes getting anything to increase your protein and store your muscle and your tissue fat is probably a good move. So it's sort of like you have to evaluate each person differently.
I think we need more nutritionists in that cancer field. Right. Before we break up, so I know I've gone over time, and I just want to I remember there was interesting, you were all about the fructose. Fructose is if you haven't got the message, it's fructose. But again, fructose comes from many other things. We produce our own fructose as well. But just to give you, you have a great list in the book about what you think is activating the fat switch and what isn't. Some of the safer ones were like stevia and monk fruit. But I was wondering if you heard about, well, first of all, please clear the confusion on agave, because too many people are using agave and they don't understand that's pure fructose, right?
Yeah, that's pure fructose. Yeah, I would stay away from agave. It tastes good, right? Agave, they make margaritas and things like it with them. And you think that it's because it's a natural product that it's probably going to be good. But unfortunately, it really has a lot of fructose. Apple juice has a lot of fructose too. And it's like a glass of apple juice is pretty much equivalent to a soft drink.
Amazing.
So I would be careful with agave. There's another one that's kind of bad. It's called sorbitol, and it's often used in syrup. So you're at an IHOP or something, and you say, okay, well, I'm eating pancakes, which are bad for me, but I'm going to get sugar-free syrup. And then they bring you the sugar-free syrup, and you happen to read it, and it says sorbitol. And unfortunately, sorbitol is in that glucose gets converted to fructose through sorbitol. Glucose is converted to sorbitol, and then sorbitol is converted to fructose. So when you eat sorbitol, you don't absorb 100% of it, but what you do absorb is going to be converted to fructose. So,
yeah,
if you give there's a hereditary disease where you really have a negative response to fructose. You get terrible reactions, and they can't eat sorbitol, and because it will trigger the same reaction. So
yeah,
I would be careful about sorbitol.
yeah.
Monk fruit, stevia, they're pretty healthy, we think. Splenda or sucralose, everyone's kind of worried about it because it's got a chlorine in it. But there isn't so much evidence that it's bad. But one problem with all artificial sugars is that they do encourage you to seek sweets. And so it doesn't really get rid of craving. So the craving for sugar is definitely not blocked when you're eating artificial sugars. So that makes it harder because you still want sweets.
Yeah. On the one hand, you think, well, okay, so these other sugars, you just put a drop or two or three. It doesn't take a lot to sweeten something. Right. But I generally like to recommend to my clients, and I do it myself, is just the minimal amount, because you're right. It's not going to stop these sugar cravings. And I think in your book, you mentioned 5 days to 2 weeks without any sugars or sweets, and that can help a lot with the sugar cravings. And I witnessed it myself with my own clients.
Absolutely.
It's hard, but it's definitely worth it. The body definitely changes. Have you heard, there's a new sugar on the market that I haven't heard about before called trehalose. Have you heard of this one?
Well, that's the sugar that's in insects and stuff. It's actually that's
protein
the blood
type
that's
sugar.
It's a blood sugar that's in I haven't studied it, but it probably does not activate the switch, as far as I can tell. But we haven't studied it too much. There's another one also called allulose, which a lot of people are talking about.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
So there's a lot of new things come, and each one has to be evaluated and tested. But we know that most artificial sugars do not activate the switch, but they do stimulate craving.
Yeah. So what would you say if somebody's baking at home? Okay, let's say you're trying to be healthy, you're making your own stuff at home, and you want to sweeten something. Would you recommend sweetening it with banana or dates, or would you sweeten it with a xylitol or stevia or monk fruit?
Yeah, I would pick the latter. I think stevia, monk fruit, Splenda, allulose, these are safer because they don't seem to activate the switch. My family, we tend to like sugar-free desserts. And
What do you make,
so
for example?
so my wife is a fantastic chef, and
Yay.
she makes she uses stevia a lot, and she uses Splenda. I've been reading about it. I realized that there's a lot of negative aspects about Splenda, but if you actually look at the science, there's not so much evidence that it's bad. And when we've given sucralose to animals, they do not get metabolic syndrome, but it does stimulate cravings. So I mean, I think if you can do without artificial sugars and eat like a natural fruit instead, even though it has a little bit of fructose, it has all these other things in it that are so good, like vitamin C and epicatechins and flavonols. I think that's a better way to go, like berries, kiwi. Some of them are relatively low in fructose, and I think those are better. If you have that craving for sweet, that's a better way to go. But, people do like cakes and so forth. So, if you're going to do that, a sugar-free, like using stevia or sucralose is okay. But, you have to watch out because the cake can be high glycemic. So there are these like keto cakes and stuff like that don't do that.
Yeah, it's so it's one of those things. Everybody's got to guess, choose their poison and
Right.
try to keep it as low as possible,
Right.
regardless. So another question about, because we're talking, about fructose and how that converts in fat switch, but I'm wondering your thoughts. You don't think you mentioned it in the book, and this is more about blood sugar control, and I don't know if it has anything to do with fructose, but berberine seems to be a really great one for that. Does that affect the fructose conversion at all?
No, I don't think it does, but it is good for reducing insulin resistance. I've been collecting papers on it and plan to study it, but we haven't really studied it. But there's definitely a literature supporting it as being an alternative, a natural or a nutraceutical approach towards reducing insulin resistance, and people swear by it. I mean, it's possible it could influence the switch, so it might have a direct effect on the switch, but I don't think it does. There are some nutraceuticals that do affect the switch. Mangosteen, we've published on that. Ostol, which is from Angelica.
That's
Archangel.
Literally on my notes here to ask you about that next.
Yeah.
Ostol, what is
luteolin.
that?
It was so cool. We were screening plants products to see if we could block the switch, and we had our biggest hit was with a plant that's from northern Sweden, and it's this plant that makes fructose and then converts it to a polymer of fructose called fructans, and then it will break down the fructans to make fructose. And it turns out that when it's there's a point in time where it doesn't want to break down the fructans, and it probably makes it a natural fructose inhibitor related to that. At least it's possible. But at any rate, it turns out that this plant makes an inhibitor for fructose, and it's called Ostol. And
where do we get it? How do we get it?
I think you can buy it. We when we were testing it, we got purified Ostol from a company.
Mm-hmm.
But and we definitely can block fructose effects with ostol in laboratory mice and so forth. But they have to eat a fair amount. What we don't know is how safe it is in humans, at large doses. I know many groups, several groups have reached out to me that are interested in testing it in humans. But we don't have proof in humans that like one tablet of ostol is going to work, and we don't know how many tablets you would need. But you certainly can block fructose effects in the mouse or in the rat by giving ostol. So
we want to know about humans. Let's
Yeah,
get. What about mangosteens? Have you found that in humans?
We haven't really. So most of our studies have been done in animals, laboratory animals, like luteolin's another one, and so we think these are promising for testing in humans, but we would like to actually test it in humans.
Yeah, because you mentioned in the book, I think there were drugs that are supposed to be coming out in the market to block the fructose metabolism. I mean, that's would be the future, I guess.
Eli Lilly is actively involved. I have a little company. We're trying to make an inhibitor as well. But Eli Lilly has already done a phase 1 trial. And so Pfizer,
when does that, you think that would be available to the market?
I don't know. I'm hoping in the next few years.
And so would that be somebody just, they can eat whatever they want and then just pop that drug and everything would be fine?
Theoretically, as much as theoretically,
that's the magic pill.
Theoretically, it should really help. Yeah, the knockout animal, if you have a mouse that lacks that enzyme, they're pretty healthy, and they even they live longer too. I mean, they don't get a lot of aging changes or blocks, so it's really looks like a magnificent target.
It's incredible. We'll see. To be continued. I mean, I definitely would like to have you on when you when you come up with that. And then we'll see what happens. But I would love to have that. Before I let you go, I would just love everyone to please read your book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat: The Surprising Science Behind Why We Gain Weight and How We Can Prevent and Reverse It. You can get that on Amazon, Ben Bella Books. You can find more information. You can reach out to Dr. Richard Johnson at drrichardjohnson.com. And that's an easy place to find lots of information about you and the amazing research you do. Is there any last words you'd like to have before I let you go?
No, but thank you very, very much for having me on your show. I'm glad that you found it informative.
It's super informative. Really, I'm so glad. And I want a part 3 when we have the
Okay, that sounds great.
Wonderful.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, and have a good day, good night, good morning, wherever you guys are. Good night.